before we watch our video, I would like to give you some informational background so that when Dr. Bergsman talks about certain things, he assumes that you know them already. So what I'll do is I'll give you some background first so that when he talks about it, you can more fully understand what he's talking about. And I've listed 5 of them, so it's going to be a long while before we watch the video. The first one is, we already saw, for some of you who've been attending the Bible study, we'll talk about the 4 Gospels. Why 4? Why not just one? Why the church has to choose 4 of them? And as we see later on, there's actually a lot of Gospels that were written after the first 4. Like in the year 100, 200, 300, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, Judas, Peter, Gospel of Mary. But the church ended up with the 4 Gospels that they think is closest to the sin, to the crime sin. That's their first criteria, the closer you are on the apostolic tradition. And of course, the second one is they want to make sure that the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the main one. Because like in the Gospel of Thomas, it's mostly sayings, right? Sayings of Jesus. And some of them are not. Jesus is so divine yet. So they have, the Gospel has to emphasize Jesus' divinity and his humanity. Because some Gospel writers just emphasizes the divinity of Jesus. So we'll also talk about the different religious group during the time of Jesus. Why is it so important? Because it gives us a glimpse of the attitude during the time that's permeating at the time. And then, of course, the first Jewish revolt and the destruction of the temple. I don't know if you heard about this, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi codices. I hope you can tune in on that one. All right, we'll begin with, so for the first word that probably John Bergsman talks about is the word synoptics. So you hear the word synoptics on his talk. And when he talks about synoptics, he talks about the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They call them synoptics from 2 Greek words, which means syn, together, optics, view. So these 3 Gospels are written with the same eye. And if you've been reading the Gospel, at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see the similarities in them. That's why they call it synoptic. And of course, you have John, the 4th Gospel. So while the synoptics are seen together, they're actually different in many ways, like the time of writing, who's the audience, where did they wrote, the places, audience, and the setting. I'm not going to talk about that anymore because we can spend a lot of time otherwise. But just to do a quick one, so this is the time of writing, of course. I don't know if you notice, Mark was the first one that was written. I know in the New Testament it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But it is actually Mark was first written in around 65 to 70 AD. And then that was followed by Matthew and Luke around 80, 90. And then the Gospel of John, which is the last one, was written about 90 to 100 AD. And as you can see here, Mark, Luke and Matthew borrowed so much from Mark. In fact, Matthew took 90% Mark and added his details depending on what issues he wants to address. So I'm doing this quickly. So Mark, his name is John Mark. He's a Jewish convert to Christianity, and he wrote in Rome. And then Matthew is also a Jewish convert to Christianity. His community initially belongs to Palestine, and then they moved to Syria. Actually, a large population of Jewish Christians live in Antioch, which is, Peter is very popular in that area. Actually, it's the first place where the Christians there used to be, Christians were used to be called the people on the way. People on the way. So first time that this group of people were called Christians in Antioch. So Matthew wrote in Antioch. And then Luke, he's a Gentile, he's not Jewish, but his persuasion is Jewish, and he converted to Christianity and he wrote in Greece. Now in John, let me look at my notes. In John, what did I say? So the Gospel of John is traditionally attributed to the beloved disciples of Jesus. So whoever the author is, and though Dr. Bergson has his idea of who the author is, whoever the author is, the Gospel was written, like I said earlier, around in Ephesus during the late 1990s. Okay. So, but before Ephesus, the community initially lived in Palestine. And then they moved to Ephesus later on. Initially lived in Palestine, composed mostly of Jewish Christians, including followers of John the Baptist, and we see that in the readings where Jesus, John has his way of showing the first disciples. So you have a different account of how the disciples were called, and this is how the first disciples were called according to John. And then, of course, the Samaritans later expanded to include the Samaritans. That's why there's the story of the Samaritan woman. And then, of course, the last one is this community is composed of Gentiles, and we see that in John 12. Now, there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. So the community, like I said, was forced to move from Palestine to Ephesus due to severe persecution by the Jews. So what happened is that the Christians are being expelled from the synagogue. It is important to note that the Christians were considered as just one another sect in Judaism. So they're not an entirely different group, like we just had the Pentecost last Sunday, isn't it? I know it's the birth of the church, and that's the beginning of Christianity, but Christianity didn't start that way as one group. They were actually part of the Jewish religion, and people consider them as Jewish. Of course, the Christian, they're Christians, but a lot of people consider them as one of the Jewish sect. So, but the Christians were forced out of the synagogue. So you can see even the Acts of the Apostles, where John and Peter spend their first days in the temple, or they go on synagogue. Up to the time of Paul, you see them preaching in the synagogue. So they're like one of the Jewish sect. But the Christians were forced out of the synagogue when it was decided that people who believe in Jesus, that Jesus is the Son of God, will be charged as a blasphemer. So that's when the break started to crack. Because you're claiming Jesus is the Son of God, then they said, that cannot be, because if Jesus is the Son of God, remember, of course, Judaism is a monotheistic religion. Mono means one, theist means God, one God. They believe in one God. The three main religions believe in one God: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. But if Jesus is the Son of God, it implies that there are how many gods now? There are two gods. So what they decided is, then you're blaspheming. So they started to, cast them out of the synagogue and persecute them. So the Gospel of John was written as a Christian response on who Jesus really is. For John, Jesus is the Son of God, the incarnate Word of God who became flesh, who comes from God, descended into the world, and dwelt among the people. And he came to that which was his own, which is the Jewish people. You know, Jesus is 100% Jew. He was born as a Jew, a Jewish parent. He lived as a Jew. He observed all the tradition of the Jewish people, and he died as a Jew. He came to his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believe in his name, he gave them the right to become children of God. Okay. So that's the first introduction. The second one is the religious political authorities during the time of Jesus. So it would be a mistake to think that Judaism in the time of Jesus is a state religion. You know, we have state religion now, mostly in the Middle East, isn't it? But even during the time of Jesus, Judaism is not a state religion. Even though they have a temple, which is the centerpiece of their Jewish life and of Jewish worship, Judaism is not a monolithic religion or cultural identity at this time. Some scholars have gone so far as to talk about Judaisms with an S instead of one Judaism. So what are the religious group or sects during the time of Jesus that are competing with the minds and hearts of the people? Like even in the church, you know, you have different group who wants to recruit people in their group. Even, you know, in the world of Christianity, you have different congregations, different denominations. So in the same way, in Judaism, we have different groups competing with the minds and hearts of the people. So the question we have is, what are their main beliefs, their social and political connection, and their relationship with one another, and their view of Jesus, what do they think of Jesus, and at the same time, Jesus' views of them. And we see that all in the Gospel. So we'll start with the most famous and known, the Pharisees. Okay, you know, all about the Pharisees, isn't it? So in the first centuries, Pharisees are known to us from the New Testament, where they enjoy a very negative press. They're clearly seen as the opponent of Jesus, as one of the bad guys. Who the Pharisees really were is a different question once we entirely get past the anti-Pharisee presentation of the Pharisees, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. So while the Gospel presentation of the Pharisees is usually negative, so this is probably new to you, the Pharisees are actually closer to Jesus theologically. Because the Pharisee Jesus believes in the resurrection, the angels and the spirits. Secondly, they are also more closer to the people. They're more closer to the masses compared to the other religious group. So these are pious men. They're not religious, they're not priests, they're laymen like us. The one I can compare them with our modern times they're like the Knights of Columbus. Laymen, religious people who serves the people. And Pharisees, I know it doesn't sound the way the gospel writers write them. But the Pharisees are close to Jesus as far as the people is concerned, and as far as theologically is concerned. So the word Pharisees in Hebrew means the separated ones. Through true to the meaning of the word, these pious men are open, separating themselves from the common people because of their strict observance of the written law and the traditional law, which is what we call the oral law. Therefore, they feel moral superiority over ordinary Jews. Because they were the teachers of the law, they held important position in the synagogues, which were the house of worship and instruction, particularly used before Jesus, during the time of Jesus, and during and after the time of Jesus, up to this time. So I'll explain that later on. But Jesus' success as a teacher, no doubt, stirred jealousy and competition among this religious group. Next group is the Sadducees. Sadducees believe only in the first 5 books of the Bible. There's 47 books in the Old Testament, and they only believe on the first 5 books, which is what you call the Torah or the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers. They only believe on that. The rest they don't believe, like the prophets, or the stories of Joshua, the Judges, the First and Second Kings. Sadducees apparently has a great deal of following among the well-to-do. They're the rich, the rich kind. They belong to the upper class and among the priestly class. Actually, their name Sadducees actually comes from the word Sadok, which is a priestly name. So, but they are being characterized by 2 things. First is they oppose the Pharisees, like I said, who are pro-masses, and 2, that they deny belief in the resurrection of the dead, spirit, and angels. And see that in the account in the Gospel of Mark, when they ask Jesus, who will be the husband of the wife whose 7 husbands died in the resurrection. So that's when the Sadducees came. So belonging to the priestly class, they are in charge of the temple and therefore cooperated with the political establishment, including the Herodians and the Romans. Next group are the Essenes. It's a small group of Jews. So they were offended by the rampant materialism they saw in all around them. So they were sad at the degradation of the priestly class, which merged with the Jerusalem aristocracy. So the priests are more, they're like, I don't want to say anti-poor, but they congregate more on the rich people. So they moved into the Judean desert. So that's the Dead Sea. And they didn't like the temple, they didn't like what's happening in Jerusalem. So what they did is they went out, go to the desert, and established their community in Qumran. That's the Dead Sea, that's Bethlehem, and that's Jerusalem. And I suppose somewhere here is Jericho, probably around the north. And this is where they live, in caves. So there's caves around that area. Okay. It is clear that they rejected the Jerusalem temple, or at least its priesthood. The Essenes themselves were very apocalyptic. They talk about the end times a lot of times, and saw themselves as the true sons of light. They live in a monastic and community life, and were very concerned with ritual purity. Next one are the Zealots. They're fiercely nationalistic, political, and religious movement dedicated to the removal of foreign influence over Judea. I think one of Jesus' disciples, Judas.
Yeah.
Or Simon, I think Simon.
It was
Judas there.
It was Judas the Zealot.
The Zealot.
Yeah.
I haven't Simon, not Judas.
Yeah.
Because Judas is the Zealot. And even they think that Judas himself was a sympathizer of the Sadducees. Because, the other side of the story is he wants Jesus to start a revolution so that the kingdom, because taking him 3 years already and nothing is happening. All the miracles are good, but your objective is to topple the Roman. Then you have to start the revolution already. And even I think Barabbas is described in this passage as a violent. So he might be a member of the Sadducees. So the Herodians are not religious group, but they are very influential because they're the ruler at the time. Of course, they belong to the upper class. And they saw Jesus as a threat to their political power. And they also had conflict with the Pharisees. Because like I said, Pharisees are pro-masses, and these are political people, so they always clash. But the thing is, in the Gospel of Mark at least, you see the Herodians and the Pharisees conniving with each other on how to destroy Jesus. Because you have a saying, is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or something like that. Something like that. And then lastly, again, the scribes. You heard their names, the scribes. Scribes are not actually a religious group. And they're not even writers. I know you think, scribes are writers, isn't it? But they are actually lawyers. Lawyers of the law of Moses. So it's an office. It's an office, okay. So the Pharisee group, have their own scribes. Because you need experts of the law for your group. So they hire scribes. That's why I think they depended on the nation, on the temple. So the Sadducees have their own scribes. They hire lawyers and scribes. That's why even in the Gospel of Mark, you see Jesus arguing more on the scribes than the Pharisees. I don't know if you've been counting, but Jesus is arguing more with the scribes rather than the Pharisees. And of course, the last one, like I said earlier, one of the religious group during Jesus' time are the people on the way. And that's how they were described. And it's only in the church of Antioch they were called Christians. They were called Christianitos. Little Christians. It's more of a derogatory name rather than a good name. First Jewish revolt. So you see Dr. Bersma talks about this revolt. And so I thought I'd explain this a little bit more. So when Jesus was born in 4 BC, not 0 BC, okay, because he was born at the time of Herod, who died on 4 BC. So he must be born before 4 BC. So they had to correct that. So when Jesus was born, King Herod the Great was the ruler of Judea, where Jerusalem is, and the whole Palestine, which is a Roman occupied, but they hired Herod the Great as the administrator. And he ruled for 33 years. And he died just shortly after Jesus was born. But he was hated by his Jewish subjects because he exercised his power through terror and brutality. The Gospel writer says that, but Josephus, one of the Jewish historians who was writing about the story of Israel during the time, described him as really bad. Like he killed his sons, he killed his wives, because he killed his son because he was thinking that they will overthrow him. So together he killed him in advance. But the further reason for his oh, by the way, he's not 100% Jew. He's partly Jew. I guess one of his parents is on the southern part of Israel, so he's not 100% Jewish. But he had this agreement with Rome. You make me king, and then I'll manage it. But one of his unpopularity was his violation of the traditional Jewish law. He built numerous pagan temples and even staged electoral contests in Jerusalem. However, he also rebuilt the second temple. Remember in the Gospel of Mark, I think all the synoptics, the disciples were just amazed at the temple because it's the one of the most marvelous structure during the time, the temple. I think it was built for more than 60 years. So until up to the time of Jesus, they're still finishing up the details. So this is a picture of the second temple, but around it are some more structures, okay? Let me see. But after, so that replaces the first temple that was built by Solomon 1,000 years earlier. So after Herod's death in, like I said, in 4 BC, social unrest became more open. Bandits often ruled the countryside, and they did guerrilla warfare. And the Romans assumed more and more direct power over Judea. So riots were not uncommon, or common during that time, leading eventually to the outbreak of the first Jewish revolt. First, meaning there's a second one, but I'm not going to talk about the second one. This is the first one. First Jewish revolt against Rome, which began in 66 AD up to 73 AD. Remember, Mark was written when? 65 AD, just before the destruction of the temple. And Matthew and Luke wrote in 85, about 15 years after that. And I guess that's an artist's rendition where the Roman authorities destroyed all Jerusalem and the temple. There's almost not one stone unturned. And what is left is just what you call the Western Wall, which is now considered the most holiest place in Israel, where devout Jews praise, and you see people, if you're visiting Jerusalem, you probably want to go there, and they usually put some prayers in the crevices of the rocks as a prayer. But so when the Romans burned Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, after the destruction of the second temple, which is that one and that one, we don't hear much about the conflicting sect that I described earlier. None of them survived. The Sadducees, the priests are gone because there's no more temple. The Zealots are gone because all of them were almost killed. All of them are most of the people in Jerusalem was sold as slaves. And the Herodians, of course, they're the power at the time, and they're all gone. And the Essenes, what did they do? Remember, first of all, they hate Jerusalem. They hate the temple. Even before that time, they were already establishing communities in the desert. But later on, they were gone also. Okay? So for the Pharisees, what emerged for the first time, and there's only 2 groups that was left, okay? And the first group are of course, the Pharisees, because they're not only concentrated in the temple. Remember, they're pro-masses and pro-people. They're scattered around Israel in their local synagogues where they preside. And that's the only place that they can worship that was left. So they remained strong up to this time. And then the other group is what? Who?
The Christians.
The Christians. They're the ones that remain. The two groups that remain, the Pharisees and the Christians. So for the Pharisees, what emerged for the first time is a new way of thinking and writing and learning, which is no longer centered in the temple because it was destroyed. The local synagogue, which is now led by the Pharisees, became the center of worship and learning. The rabbinic Judaism now emerged as a new kind of Judaism that will endure from the 2nd century up to the present time. What else? As we know it. Next one are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, I'm rolling. Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know if you heard this one before, Dead Sea Scrolls. Are a collection of roughly 1,000 ancient Jewish manuscripts discovered by the shepherds between 1946 and 1956 in 11 caves. So count all of them. Remember, they lived around that area. They withdrawn from the Jerusalem and withdrawn there. They include the oldest known survival copies of the biblical text, radically transforming our understanding of the Hebrew Old Testament Bible and early Christianity. Scholars widely believe that they were written and hidden by the Essenes, which is the group we were talking about, the apocalyptic Jewish sect that lived in the Judean desert. So the manuscripts were written primarily in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek. So almost all the Old Testament, it's in this jar. Yeah. Which is like written in papyrus. The scrolls are generally categorized into 3 main groups. I think the story was this, I don't know if this Israelite man, he saw the area and he threw a stone and he heard something crack. So he went out and investigated, and he didn't know what he was finding, because it's the scrolls are generally categorized into 3 main groups. Fragments or copies of every book in the Old Testament, making them over 1,000 years older. And this is what, 1947? So 1,000 years before, because the earliest Hebrew Bible manuscript at that time that they found was 900 AD. 900 AD. So like 1,000 years after Christ. Okay? And this one is like earlier, much earlier. And what is included there is so all the book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther, and also it contained the religious and philosophical texts dating to the Second Temple period, which is the temple that Herod built. That become part of the standard biblical canon, and they have sectarian documents, meaning that group. What that group means?
Since the essence.
The essence. So they included all the rules, hymns, commentaries unique to the essence. And lastly, scholars drew several fascinating parallels between the writing of the Qumran and the Gospel of John. Let me see. For example, the dualistic language, both texts meaning the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospel of John emphasizes strong moral dualism, contrasting light and darkness. You see that in the Gospel, which you can see in the language of the Qumran community. And then truth and falsehood, spirit of truth and spirit of deceit. And also the word logos. And also there's also a connection between John the Baptist. The Dead Sea Scrolls shows immense light on John the Baptist's public ministry. A lot of Bible scholars think that John the Baptist belongs to this community because he lives in an ascetic life. He eats only honey, milk, no, not milk,
Locos.
locust and honey. And he fasts. He lives in the desert. So they think that he actually is part of this community. And then he decided to establish his own public ministry. Both the Qumran essence and John the Baptist relied on Isaiah chapter 40, a voice of one calling in the desert. Leading scholars suggest that John the Baptist may have been a member of the essence. Because both of them also talk about the coming of God in apocalyptic terms. So why is this significant? So why is this significant compared to Christianity? Remember, this is like what, 40 years after Jesus. So this all talks about the Jewish community. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scroll sheds new light in the early community detailing daily life, religious law, and apocalyptic expectation of the era. So the Qumran community shared several traditions with the early Christians, like their ritual purification, which is in Christianity is similar to baptism. So they have this baptismal bath that they have. They have also communal meals, which we have as Eucharist, and they hold property in common, like the early Christians, which is described in the Acts of the Apostles. The Qumran community was governed by a council of 12 men, like the 12 disciples. So very similar, and led by a priest, providing a parallel to the leadership structure of the early church. Last one, before we go to the video, okay, are the Nag Hammadi codices. So it appeared in 1945, so that's like 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they were very popular during that time, but when the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were like overcome or overruled by the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay. Nag Hammadi codices. So the discovery of the Dead Sea. Okay. So like Judaism, so this was discovered in 1945, but it describes the life of the Christian community after 100 AD up to the 3rd century. So like Judaism, Christianity is not a monolithic religion. Remember in Judaism, you have different sects, Pharisees, Sadducees. It's the same way with Christianity. In the 2nd century up to the 4th century. So the Christian community, you would think that Christianity started in Jerusalem and it went eastward up to Rome, and you think all of them are all communities established by Paul are Christian. No, there were a lot of Christian communities that doesn't belong to that. You have communities in Egypt, in Syria, and they have all their own ideas actually about who Jesus is. So we don't have internet at the time where you can double check what is these people saying. Pretty much everyone is on its own, and people, they communicate. And usually they don't call by phone. What I'm saying, they travel by ships, and so they have. What I'm saying is Christianity is diverse during that time, very much the same way as Judaism, where you have different sects and you have different Christian sects. So it is a time when Christians try to figure out exactly what Christianity is and exactly what Christianity isn't. So there are competing interpretation of Jesus' teachings before the official Orthodox doctrine were established in the year 367, establishing the 27 books of the New Testament. So you all have this Christian sect, different denomination like what we have today. Until the church decided, no, we have to firm up what we believe and what belongs to the New Testament, and that's the time to be established. So what happened is they but they took out some what you call heretical groups, and some of them are called the Gnostics. So several prominent early groups were eventually labeled heretical by the mainstream church, inadvertently forcing early Christianity to define its central text and belief. You have to tell us, the rules and regulations, set boundaries, what are true Christians. And among the heretical groups are what you call the Gnostics. Much of what we know about the Gnostics comes from the Nag Hammadi codices. The Nag Hammadi codices are a collection of 13 ancient papyrus manuscripts discovered in 1945, containing over 50 primarily Gnostic Christian texts. So this material belongs to the Gnostic groups. These codices provided an unparalleled look into the diverse and mystical belief system in the early Christianity. So how did they find this? And the Dead Sea Scroll, actually the shepherd, so he saw the caves. So he was curious, they were like opening cave. He threw a stone, and then he heard something crack, which is what contained the scrolls. Anyway, this shepherds, I guess, they were collecting manure or fertilized soil, and they were digging, and then this earthen vessel shows up, and it contained manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scrolls is more like a scroll. That's what this one is more like a book, because this is like 400 years already. So it contains like this. And these are peasant people, they don't know idea what they found. And they brought it home. It took a while before they recognized it. And the story is, some of the paper, they even use for cooking. Because they have no idea. They have no idea. They eventually sold it to a priest for some not large amount of money, and then they found out that these are the text that belongs to a Gnostic group. So this is around mid-300s to 400 AD. So the collection contains a mix of mythologies, theological treatises, and alternate accounts of Jesus' life and teachings. That included the Gospel of Thomas, the famous Gospel of Thomas, like I said earlier, where the main emphasis is not the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus, but the saying of Jesus, what he said. And some of them are so out of this world that it's like you're talking to an alien. So that's why it was not included in the four Gospels. Actually, it's not in my notes. The Gospel of John almost did not make it to the four Gospels, because Jesus is so divine in the Gospel of John. That's why the Gnostics, the Gospel of John was popular among the Gnostics. because in the Gospel of John, Jesus is pictured as divine. You know, it's like out of this world, and almost didn't make it to the four Gospel. Secondly, it's so different from the other three. That's why they thought maybe, but later on they decided that it should be included because of some, I think Irenaeus, one of the famous saints during that time, vouched for its authenticity. So, anyway, the codices were likely buried by monks that belonged to this group from nearby monastery about the 4th century to protect them from being destroyed, following decrees that banned non-canonical books. So remember, they established the 4, no more. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which belongs to this collection. You have Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Judas, and there's many more. So in 361, the church decided that these are the 27 books of the New Testament. You cannot add or delete any more. And this text is, although it's for the Gnostic community, is very important in our understanding of the early Christian community at the time, because it proved that early Christianity was not a monolithic movement. It's not just one mind and one heart. Each one, Christian communities has dispersed in Rome, in Greece, in Turkey, in Syria, in Egypt, in Alexandria. And many of this group practice Gnosis because salvation is achieved through esoteric, and then provides an environment into that verse. All right. I talk a lot, so now I'm so apologize, but we'll now go to the video. I don't know.
Hi there, this is Dr. John Bergsma from the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology and the Franciscan University of Steubenville, and welcome to this course on the Gospel of John. I'm just so delighted that the powers that be appointed me to bat cleanup on the treatment of the Gospels among the theologians here at the St. Paul Center, and gave me my favorite Gospel, the Gospel from whom my name ultimately is traced, and that is the Gospel of the beloved Apostle John. And so John has always been a hugely significant New Testament book in the influence in the church. It's the reverence with which it's been held. Traditionally, among the Gospels, John is referred to as the eagle that soars above the rest. And in the Eastern tradition, the author, the Apostle John, is referred to as the theologian, showing the respect that the Eastern tradition has for him. In the liturgy of the Western Church since Vatican II, the Gospel of John has a privileged position, has had a privileged position in previous lectionaries as well, but especially during the seasons of Lent and Easter, the Church turns increasingly to the Gospel of John, and also on the actual celebrations of the day for most of the high holy solemnities throughout the church year. Holy Mother Church turns to John. So, there is a good argument to be made that John is the greatest book in world literature, since the Bible is the world's perennial bestseller, and of all the books of the Bible, the Gospel of John is most beloved and most revered by a common consensus. So it is the cream of the cream, arguably the greatest book ever written in human history. And so we're going to jump into it now. And in this initial talk on John, I want to hit 5 items: the authorship of the book, its date, its structure, its relationship to the other Gospels, and finally a little bit about its literary style. So first of all, the authorship of the Gospel of John. We are going to defend the traditional position that it is from the Apostle John, and that position, in fact, is the only position that has any substantial evidence to support it. I know there are contemporary scholars who will dispute it, but they really lack any evidence to support some other author. Let's go through the evidence for John the Apostle, son of Zebedee, as the author of John. First of all, there is the external evidence, and it is very, very strong. All of the church fathers that address the issue affirm that John wrote the gospel. You will not find a single father who disputes this. And the testimony is not only unanimous, but it is very widespread. There are dozens of fathers who affirm it. And it's also very early, going back to the very earliest of the apostolic fathers, figures like Papias. So Pope Leo XIII, who wrote the first encyclical on Scripture in the Catholic Church, a document called Providentismus Deus, Leo XIII defined that the unanimous consent of the fathers is infallible. So if we take Leo XIII seriously, which we should, we as Catholics should not even debate the authorship of the Gospel of John, because the fathers already settled it by their unanimity, and that should be regarded as infallible. But there is an additional source of external evidence in addition to the church fathers, and that is the manuscript witness. All of our ancient copies of the Gospel of John read either at the beginning or at the end, kata Ioannein, which it means according to John. We do not have extant, which means in existence, any anonymous copies of the Gospel of John, or any copies which are attributed to anybody else. That should be taken into account as very strong historical evidence that the association of John with this Gospel goes back to the very beginning of its publication. Then this external evidence of the fathers and the manuscript witnesses is supported by various lines of internal evidence. For example, when we read the Gospel of John, we quickly discover, if we do our historical research, that the author is very familiar with the geography of Israel and especially Jerusalem prior to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. To cite just one example, in John chapter 5, the author refers to a healing of a paralytic which takes place at these twin pools of Bethesda, which are surrounded by 5 porticos. A portico is a long colonnade down which you can walk with pillars on either side and a covering over the top. Now, prior to the middle of the 20th century, prior to around the 1950s, a lot of skeptical and secular scholars disputed the historicity of John 5, claiming that the author was talking about a pentagonal building with these 5 colonnades, and no such pentagon-shaped building was known from antiquity. So it was argued that the author was just making this up, perhaps to resemble the 5 books of Moses or something of that sort. Then in the middle of the 20th century, archaeologists began to unearth this area of Bethesda in ancient Jerusalem, and they found that indeed it did have 5 porticos, but the porticos went in a rectangle around the twin pools, and then there was a 5th portico down the middle separating the 2 pools. So it was never envisioned as a pentagonal structure. So the historicity of John 5 and that location was verified by archaeology. And significantly, no one after the year 70 could have known about that, because in the year 70, the Romans completely flattened Jerusalem, erasing all of these landmarks and various geographical features. So, to summarize, the author clearly is a first-century Jew who is familiar with the culture and the geography prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. That would agree with the author being the Apostle John. Secondly, there are striking parallels of terminology between the Gospel of John and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, all of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written prior to the year 70 because the monastery called Qumran where they were written and preserved, was also destroyed along with the city of Jerusalem. So most of the scrolls date between 150 BC and AD 70. That is the time period just prior to and during the birth and ministry of our Lord and of the apostles. So they are contemporary witnesses. And strikingly, in 1948, when the texts of the scrolls began to be translated and published, immediately scholars recognized that dozens of phrases found in the scrolls were only elsewhere found in ancient literature in the writings of John. That was hugely significant because prior to the discovery of the scrolls, these unique Johannine phrases were often attributed to the influence of Greek philosophy centuries after Jesus. And so folks were going around claiming that the Gospel of John was written as late as the 3rd century, that's the 200s, and therefore had no real historical relevance to the real Jesus who lived in the 1st century. But suddenly with the discovery of the scrolls, we find out, no, these unique Johannine phrases like Spirit of Truth, which is found in John and also found in the community rule in the Dead Sea Scrolls and nowhere else in ancient literature. Again, those unique phrases show that the author of John, whom we believe to be the apostle, was actually using religious jargon that was characteristic of the 1st century AD. That is very, very strong evidence for the authenticity of this writing. And finally, talking about internal evidence, this is a weaker point, but still one worth mentioning. Frequently in the Gospel of John, the details are so specific and yet not necessarily theologically significant that it really does sound like an eyewitness testimony. In the Gospel of John, we get little details like when Mary opens her bottle of pure nard to anoint Jesus, that the fragrance wafted through the whole house. Little details like Peter warmed himself over a fire during Jesus' trial, and the fire was made of charcoal and not of some other combustible material. Little details like when the apostles hauled ashore the fish in the net when Jesus appeared to them in Galilee after his resurrection, that there were 153 large fish that were pulled ashore. Again, many of these details otherwise don't seem to be significant. They seem to be really the result of eyewitness testimony that the author just can't help himself to throw that in because he was there and he witnessed the fact. So we've seen 3 lines of internal evidence that confirm or support the idea that the author was a 1st century Jew who was with Jesus, and that, of course, is congruent with the author being the apostle. But then there are even some lines of internal evidence that support it specifically being John. The first line of evidence is that 3 figures very important in Jesus' life are not mentioned by name in this gospel. And those figures are the Apostle James, the Apostle John, and the Blessed Mother. Now, those 3 characters certainly do appear. James and John are mentioned under the title Sons of Zebedee in the last chapter of the book, and the Blessed Mother shows up in 2 very strategic instances, but she's only called the Mother of Jesus. So Mary, John, and James never appear in this gospel, even though the author mentions all the other apostles and even gives more airtime, so to speak, to minor apostles like Philip and Nathaniel, who don't say or do hardly anything in the other Gospels, but have a speaking role in John. So that is very unusual. How do we explain this fact that 3 key people who, along with Peter, who is mentioned, are probably the closest individuals to Jesus and to his ministry, and yet are not mentioned by name? Well, if the author is the Apostle John, we have a ready explanation, because James would be his brother, and Mary would be his adopted mother, and then John would be himself. And so what we would see then is that the author is deftly refusing to mention by name his family members. He's being a little bit coy about his family. And this is one of the ways that ancient authors would deal with how to talk about themselves in their own works. One of the methods was to treat yourself as a kind of fly on the wall and just not mention yourself. And so John does that, as well as not mention his immediate family members, James and Mary, although reading between the lines, we can identify them in certain key places, obviously. Now, that supports John being the author. If it was anybody else besides the Apostle John, you'd be hard-pressed to explain why the author would omit mentioning disciples numbers 2 and 3 and the mother of our Lord by name. The final line of evidence from reading the gospel itself that points specifically to John the Apostle is the fact that at the end of the Gospel of John, the author, so to speak, steps out from behind the curtain and identifies himself. In fact, it's the only gospel where the author identifies himself fairly clearly at the end of his work. At the end of John 21, Peter and this mysterious figure who has simply been referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved throughout the book are following Jesus along the shore. And Jesus is talking about this beloved disciple and what is it to Peter if he remains until Jesus comes back. And then in verse 24, the author identifies, this is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and who has written these things, which is very significant, claiming to be the author of this book. And we know that his testimony is true. There are also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. See, there the author finally speaks in the first person at the end of the book. Now, in antiquity, nobody failed to understand the significance of this. Everybody realized that this was the author identifying himself. Modern scholars have twisted themselves in knots trying to explain somehow, some way, that this is not an identification of the author of the book as specifically the beloved disciple who has been a key player in the drama throughout. And frankly, I don't even understand some of the arguments from contemporary scholars who are trying to do backflips to get around what has been clear to virtually all the readers of this piece of literature since antiquity. So I'm not even going to bother with that, but suffice it to say, the church has always understood this as a self-identification, and correctly so. And so the author is saying, I am this mysterious beloved disciple who plays a key role at key points in the gospel, like at the Last Supper and at the foot of the cross, etc. And then if you look at the characteristics of this beloved disciple in the Gospel of John, something striking emerges. His profile tracks very closely with the profile of the Apostle John, especially from the writings of Luke, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Because in Luke and Acts, one notices that Peter and John are a pair. They are always hanging out together. Jesus chooses those two, Peter and John, to go prepare the Last Supper. In the book of Acts, it is those two who go up to the temple and cure the lame man in Acts chapter 4. John is Peter's faithful sidekick throughout Luke and Acts. And strikingly in John, the beloved disciple, or more accurately, the disciple whom Jesus loved, is almost always in the company of Peter. He's lying next to Peter at the Last Supper. He is going with Peter to follow Jesus to the trial and to listen to the trial on the night of our Lord's arrest. He is hanging out with Peter on Holy Saturday when Mary Magdalene shows up, and then the two of them run together to the tomb. He's with Peter at the end of the gospel, right next to Peter in the boat when Jesus tells him to throw the net on the other side, etc., etc. And at the end of the book, he and Peter are following Jesus along the shore of Galilee. So, very strong correlation there. I think the combined evidence of Luke and Acts with John suggests very strongly that the beloved disciple is in fact Peter's sidekick, the much younger disciple, John, whom, by the way, I would estimate was probably about 15 or in his, at least in his teen years, much, much younger than Jesus and much, much younger than Peter at the time of our Lord's ministry. And we'll maybe go into this later, but there's many signs of the youth of the beloved disciple and therefore the author of this gospel. Okay, let's quickly talk about the date of the Gospel of John. Here we're just going to go with the church fathers. They say that John wrote the gospel late in the first century, after he had already written the book of Revelation. Interestingly, all the fathers that comment on the relationship between the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation say that Revelation was written first and then the Gospel. That's counterintuitive to me because I was raised thinking of them in the other order, but the fathers say it the other way, and I've come to agree with the fathers and think that, yeah, there's not only their testimony but other reasons to believe that. So this would place the writing of the gospel near the end of John's life. Many of the fathers talk about John being old when he writes the gospel, and how the church came to John and asked him, after Matthew, Mark, and Luke had already written, to contribute himself something. And then John wrote his gospel to kind of fill in the gaps of the other three gospels as a kind of complement to what we call the synoptic gospels. And I think that works very well actually with the nature of the Gospel of John. We'll talk about its relationship with the synoptics in just a moment. So we're going to say, I've traditionally dated John in the 90s, the AD 90s, so near the end of the first century AD. And many skeptical scholars kind of agree with that dating for a different set of reasons. Even though they don't believe that it was written by John, they would still agree, yeah, probably the 90s would be the time when it was written. Where was it written? Likely to be Ephesus, which the strong traditions associate St. John with retiring in Ephesus with the Blessed Mother. Later in the first century. That's where the traditional grave or graves of the Apostle John, I think there's two contenders, is found in the vicinity of Ephesus, so that is a good guess. All right, so we've talked about the author, we've talked about the date, let's talk about the structure of the Gospel of John. The primary structuring device of this Gospel is a sequence of 7 signs. Now, significantly, Jesus only performs basically 7 miracles in the Gospel of John, possibly 8 if you count the walking on the water, but that's kind of a unique event. But there are 7 miracles performed by Jesus in this Gospel that are identified within the Gospel as being signs. And John, the author, likes to call these works of Jesus signs rather than merely wonders or works, etc., because a sign points to something. And as we'll talk more in later lectures, the signs that Jesus performs during his earthly ministry point to the sacraments that the church will later perform after his resurrection. So one of the themes of the Gospel of John is that the signs point to sacraments, and we'll flesh that out later. For now, let's just enumerate these 7 signs of the gospel that form a kind of backbone to the narrative. The first sign in the gospel is the changing of water to wine at Cana. The second sign is the healing of the official's son in John 4. The third sign is the healing of the paralytic at the pools of Bethesda in John 5. The fourth sign is the feeding of the 5,000 and the miraculous multiplication of loaves in John chapter 6. The fifth is the healing of the man born blind in John 9. The sixth is the raising of Lazarus from the dead in John 11. After the sixth sign, we have a problem, because the sixth sign is recounted in chapter 11. And after chapter 11, the word sign is not used again throughout the rest of the gospel from John 12 through 21. And that confuses scholars because that leaves us with only 6 signs. 6 is not a fortunate number in the Jewish tradition. It's an evil number. So everybody's agreed that there can't just be 6 signs. There must be a 7th. but nothing after John 11 is referred to as a sign. But there's an easy solution to this problem. If we go back to near the beginning of the gospel in John chapter 2, when Jesus cleanses the temple, he's challenged and asked, "What sign will you show us that you have the authority to do this?" And Jesus replies, "Tear down this temple and I will raise it in 3 days." And John the author explains he is speaking about the temple of his body. That clues us into what is going to be the climactic sign of the Gospel of John. It's going to be the tearing down and the raising up of the temple body of Jesus. And that, of course, refers to his passion and his resurrection. Not just the resurrection, but the passion and the resurrection are the seventh final climactic sign of the structure, the backbone of the Gospel of John. And basically the book breaks down into two parts. John 1 through 12, often called by scholars the Book of Signs, that enumerates the first 6 signs that the apostle wants to talk about. And then the second half of the book, John 13 through 21, is basically all about the final 7th sign, the passion and the resurrection of Jesus, because that is the most momentous, that is the climactic, etc., etc. Now, we want to talk about our 4th major issue in this introductory lecture. What is John's relationship to the Synoptic Gospels? Some scholars think that John is completely dependent on the Synoptic Gospels, and it basically is like fan fiction written on the basis of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that John has no independent information about Jesus other than what is found in the 3 Synoptic Gospels, and anything that's not in the Synoptics is basically made up and fictional in the Gospel of John. And so that's a view of total dependency on the earlier 3 Gospels. On the other hand, there are scholars who argue that John is completely independent, has all of his own sources of information, has no relationship whatsoever to the other 3 Gospels, and is just this idiosyncratic outlier of a gospel that was written by some strange, isolated Christian community in Syria, perhaps, and so forth. Now, I think that neither of those 2 extremes is correct, but actually the view that we get from the Church Fathers is the truth, which is that John writes after the other 3 to complement them, in other words, to complete them. And John presumes that you already know the basic story of Jesus, and you just need to be taken a next step. You know, this is now theology not 101 like Mark, this is now theology like 525, you know, going much deeper into the Christology, the nature of Christ and his saving mission, etc. And I think we can support this view from the text of the gospel. There are many passages in John where he seems, at least to my mind and to that of others as well, clearly to assume that you, the reader, know information that would only otherwise be found in one of the other gospels. So in John 7:42, the crowd say, "Must not the Messiah be born in Bethlehem?" John himself does not refer to Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, but John is presuming that you, the reader, know from either Matthew or Luke that Jesus was indeed born in Bethlehem and therefore has the criterion to be the Messiah. Again, in John 6, out of the blue, Jesus says, "Have I not chosen you, the 12? And yet John never tells us about the choosing of the 12 or even talks about the 12 anywhere prior to John 6:67. You would be totally thrown by this unless you had read about the 12 apostles and their choosing from one of the other Gospels. In John 1:29 through 34, John the Baptist describes the baptism of our Lord at the Jordan River, but never actually says that he, John the Baptist, baptized Jesus. Our mind fills in the blanks and we recognize that John's talking about our Lord's baptism, but we only recognize that because we have knowledge from either Matthew, Mark, or Luke. In John 1:14, the author says, "We beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father." And that sounds like Peter, James, and John at the Transfiguration, and yet John doesn't recount the Transfiguration. You would have to go to Matthew, Mark, or Luke for that. In John 6, Jesus takes bread and blesses it and breaks it and distributes it to those who are reclining. About 5 or 6 words that I just said are all found within a few verses in the institution of the Eucharist narratives in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So if you know Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then you're reading John 6, you can't fail to notice the connection with the celebration of the Eucharist later in Jesus' ministry, and yet you would not know that without reading those other Gospels, because John does not have an institution narrative in his Gospel. And then finally, the miraculous catch of fish in John 21 clearly seems to be Jesus repeating the same miracle that he performed when he initially called the apostles, which is only recorded in Luke 5, 1 through 11. There it seems like John presumes you know data specifically from Luke. In fact, I think that there's a strong connection between the Gospels of Luke and John. Okay, so that's John's relationship to the synoptics. You're presumed to have read them already, and then John is taking you a step farther. So well, let's wrap up with some observations about John's literary style. I'd encourage you to look for 2 literary techniques as we progress through John. First of all, watch for irony, which is statements about reality that seem counterintuitive and almost the opposite of what we would expect. So that's irony, and the other is polyvalence, which is multiple levels of meaning. And I'll just give you one example here, which is of both irony and polyvalence. In John chapter 1 already, in verse 11, the author says, "He came to his own, and his own did not receive him." Well, that's ironic, because you would expect that if he came to his own, presumably his own people, that his own would receive him. And yet he comes to his own, and his own don't. That's counter to expectations, and therefore ironic. But there's also polyvalence at work here, because who are his own? This works on at least 2 levels of meaning. On the one hand, Jesus is a Jew, and he comes down to Judea, and he presents himself to the Judeans. They are his own because he is as Jewish as you get, from the line of David, born in Bethlehem. That's like being, a descendant of the Mayflower and born in Peoria, Illinois on the 4th of July while everybody was watching fireworks and eating apple pie and driving Chevrolets. Okay, so Jesus is as Jewish as you possibly can get, and yet the Jews do not receive him. That's ironic, but that's one layer of meaning. But on another layer of meaning, humanity is Jesus' own, because he made us all, and he comes to his own. We are his own, and we do not receive him. That is also ironic, but a different level of meaning than specifically coming to the Jews. So watch for that irony and polyvalence. Welcome to the Gospel of John. I can't wait to plunge in to our next episode where we actually begin reading the Gospel.